History is not made by plans. It is forged by mistakes. This is the story of the single greatest mathematical error in human history. A story of a man, Christopher Columbus, obsessed with a shortcut to Asia. A shortcut that didn't exist. He was a dreamer rejected by the world's experts, a fool saved by one queen's desperate gamble. He sailed 3 ships against the unknown, leading his terrified crew to the brink of mutiny. When he finally shouted, "Tierra, land!" he had not found the East. He had stumbled upon an accidental continent. It was a grand illusion he would maintain until his death. But this single flawed voyage triggered an irreversible collision. It led to a shipwreck, a hero's triumphant return, and then his arrest in chains. It unleashed the Columbian Exchange, a biological apocalypse of disease, but also a revolution of food. Smallpox for potatoes, horses for tomatoes. This is the true story of how one man's error forged the modern world. Welcome. Settle in, find your comfort, and let the noise of the present day fade into the background. You are here for a story, a journey back not just in time, but to the very edge of a world that was about to change forever. We are going to a time when the maps were incomplete, filled with dragons and assumptions, and when the known world felt like it was shrinking, closing in on itself. This is the story of a single idea, born from desperation and error that would accidentally tear the map apart and redraw it for all time. This is not just the story of a man or a voyage. It is the story of the world that needed that voyage to happen. The world on the brink. Europe's desperate search for the East. It begins with an ending. Imagine the city, a place that was more than a city. It was a symbol, the last living remnant of the Roman Empire, a fortress believed to be impregnable. Its name was Constantinople, and for 1,000 years, it had stood as the Christian gateway to the East, the magnificent bastion linking Europe and Asia. But on the 29th of May, 1453, the end came. The great Theodosian walls, which had repelled armies for a millennium, were finally breached by the massive cannons of a new power, the Ottoman Empire, and its young, ambitious Sultan, Mehmed II. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military conquest. It was a psychological earthquake. The bells that tolled in mourning across Europe, in Venice, in Genoa, in Rome, were not just for a fallen city. They were a death knell for an era. For centuries, this city had been the golden hinge of the world's trade. It was the crucial bottleneck through which the riches of the Orient flowed into Europe. Think of what those riches were. They were not luxuries as we know them. They were essentials of a different kind. Pepper, worth more than its weight in gold, was not just for flavor. It was a preservative, a way to make salted, winter-stored meat palatable. Cloves and nutmeg were potent medicines, and silk, shimmering and weightless, was the ultimate symbol of status and power. This entire river of commerce, which began in the spice islands of modern-day Indonesia, traveled through Indian ports, was carried by Arab dhows across the Indian Ocean, and then trekked by camel caravans along the punishing routes of the Silk Road, found its final European gateway at Constantinople. Here, Genoese and Venetian merchants purchased these goods and distributed them across the continent, growing fantastically wealthy in the process. With the arrival of Mehmed the Conqueror, that hinge was broken. The Ottoman Empire, now firmly in control of this critical crossroad, did not necessarily cut off the trade entirely. Instead, they did something far more effective. They controlled it. They taxed it. They imposed levies so high that the price of pepper in a Venetian market square skyrocketed, not by percentages but by multiples. A system that had functioned for centuries became unreliable, prohibitively expensive, and for Christian Europe, humiliating. The fall of Constantinople had effectively slammed a door in the face of Europe. The old way to the east, the path of Marco Polo, The familiar land routes that had defined global economics for generations was now held by a powerful and often hostile empire. Europe was trapped. To the east, the new Ottoman superpower was expanding. To the south, the vast, mysterious continent of Africa, which maps depicted as a giant, unknown landmass, blocked any easy sea route. And to the west, there was only the ocean sea, the Atlantic. In the 15th century mind, this was not an ocean to be crossed. It was a void. It was the sea of darkness and endless, terrifying expanse of water that, according to legend, held monsters, boiling currents at the equator, and eventually, just nothing. It was the edge of the world, and so, a desperation began to set in. Not the panic of a day, but the slow, grinding anxiety of a continent realizing its economic and cultural lifeline was being strangled. The great maritime republics of Italy, Venice and Genoa, which had built their empires as the middlemen of this trade, began to feel the squeeze. Their power, built on their mastery of the Mediterranean, was now contained. The Mediterranean, once the center of the world, suddenly felt like a lake. It was from this pressure, this containment, that a new ambition was born. It was born not in the traditional centers of power, but on the very edge of the map in a small, rugged kingdom that had spent its entire history looking out at that terrifying Atlantic void. Portugal. The Portuguese were a different breed of sailors. They were not Mediterranean merchants hopping from port to port. They were deep ocean explorers, hardened by the Atlantic's fierce winds and currents. For decades, under the obsessive patronage of one man, Prince Henry the Navigator, they had been engaged in a slow, methodical, and incredibly dangerous quest. Their goal was not to find a new world, but to find a new path to the old one. Their plan, to sail south. They intended to do what everyone else thought was impossible, to sail down the entire coast of Africa, and, if the continent did indeed end, to turn the corner and sail east to India. This was the enterprise of the Indies in its first, most logical form. To achieve this, they invented a new kind of ship, the caravel. It was small, light, and had a revolutionary sail plan, lateen sails, that allowed it to do something crucial: sail against the wind. This meant they could venture south into the unknown and, theoretically, return home. For generations, Portuguese sailors pushed the boundaries. They passed Cape Bojador, a place of such terror it was considered the point of no return. They discovered the Azores and Madeira, using them as laboratories for Atlantic sailing. Each voyage was a small step, funded by the Crown, each captain building on the knowledge of the last. They were mapping the void, replacing dragons with wind patterns and sea currents. In 1488, this decades-long quest had its first monumental breakthrough. A captain named Bartolomeo Diaz, caught in a vicious storm, was blown far south, completely past the coast of Africa. When the storm cleared, he turned east, expecting to find land. He found nothing but water. In a moment of dawning realization, he turned his ships north and made landfall on a coast that was, for the first time, running northeast. He had done it. He had rounded the bottom of Africa. He had found the Cape of Good Hope. The news electrified Europe. The Portuguese had done it. They had found the way. The route was theirs, a state secret zealously guarded. They were on the verge of shattering the Venetian and Ottoman monopoly and becoming the wealthiest nation on earth. This is the world in the late 1480s. It is a world on the brink. The old order is shattered. The traditional trade routes are dead. The economic center of gravity is shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And the Portuguese have a near monopoly on the only viable answer. For everyone else, for the Spanish kingdom, newly unified and eager to make its mark, for the ambitious merchants of Genoa who were now sailors without a patron, For the bankers of Florence looking for the next great investment, the Portuguese success was a disaster. It meant they were being left behind. All the logical, methodical, and proven routes to wealth were now either blocked by the Ottomans or owned by the Portuguese. The desperation for an alternative, any alternative, was palpable. The stage was set for a new idea, a different theory. It was an idea that had been floating around in scholarly circles for centuries, based on ancient Greek geography and the maps of Ptolemy. The idea that if the world was indeed a sphere, one did not need to go south around Africa. One could simply sail west. It was a theory considered by most to be madness. The ocean was believed to be far too vast. The maps were all wrong. No ship could carry enough food and water to survive the journey. It was a fringe theory, a fool's dream. But the world was now desperate enough for a fool. It was a world waiting for someone stubborn enough, charismatic enough, and most importantly, wrong enough about the size of the planet to actually attempt it. The world was on the brink, and standing in the shadows of the Spanish court, a Genoese mapmaker was polishing his charts, waiting for his moment. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he was about to use a mathematical mistake to change the world forever. And here, our first chapter closes. The stage is set. The pressures are building. The search for the East is about to send a man careening into a future no one could have ever predicted. Now let your mind drift on these currents of history and rest. Welcome back. Find your space. Let the day dissolve and allow your breathing to slow. You are here to listen, to drift. Last time we explored the world that was waiting, a 15th century Europe brimming with ambition but trapped. The old roads to the east were severed by the Ottoman Empire, and the only new path, the long perilous route around Africa, was the prized, guarded secret of the Portuguese. The world was holding its breath, waiting for a new idea, a different answer. Tonight, we do not look at the kings or the empires. We look at the man who believed he held that answer. He was a man without a kingdom, a sailor without a noble title, armed with nothing but a radical theory, a collection of old maps, and a profound, unshakable mathematical mistake. This is the story of the man himself, Christopher Columbus. A man, a map, and a mathematical mistake. Who was this man who would reroute the river of history? He was not, as many assume, Spanish. He was born Cristoforo Colombo in 1451 in Genoa, a proud, chaotic maritime republic. He was not an aristocrat. He was a weaver's son. His father, Domenico, worked with wool, a respectable but humble trade. But the young Christopher was not drawn to the loom. He was drawn to the sea. Genoa was a city of sailors, and its harbor was a school. From his boyhood, Colombo learned the craft. He was not a scholar in a university. He was an apprentice on the decks of merchant ships. He learned to read the wind, to feel the ocean's currents, to navigate by the stars. He was a product of the rough, practical, and dangerous Mediterranean trade. By his mid-20s, fate and a shipwreck brought him to Lisbon, Portugal. And for a man obsessed with the sea, there was no better place on earth to be. Lisbon, as we've learned, was the global center for oceanic exploration. Here, Columbus wasn't just a sailor. He became a student. He married a noblewoman whose father had been a navigator under Prince Henry, giving him access to a priceless inheritance, a library of charts, maps, and journals. He sailed on Portuguese ships. He traveled to England, to Ireland, and most importantly, south along the coast of Africa, to the newly established trading post of São Jorge da Mina in modern-day Ghana. He was breathing in the most advanced nautical knowledge in the world. But while the Portuguese were all looking south, obsessed with finding the bottom of Africa, Christopher Columbus was looking west. In his mind, a radical theory was forming. It wasn't that the world was round. He did not discover that. Every educated person, and certainly every navigator, of the 15th century knew the world was a sphere. The ancient Greeks had proven it. The only question was not its shape, but its size. This is where the map in Columbus's mind begins. And this is where the grand history-altering mistake is born. His enterprise of the Indies was simple. If the world is a sphere, one can reach the east, the land of gold, spices, and the great Khan of Cathay, China, by sailing west. The problem, as all the experts in Lisbon told him, was distance. The ocean was simply too vast. They had their own calculations, inherited from the brilliant Greek astronomer Eratosthenes, who, centuries before Christ, had calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. By their math, the ocean between Europe and Asia was well over 12,000 miles, an impossible void. No 15th century ship, a small wooden caravel, could carry enough food and fresh water for such a journey. It would be a suicide mission, but Columbus insisted they were wrong. He had done his own research, and this is the key to his entire obsession. He was not a scientist seeking the truth. He was a man with a conclusion, hunting for any evidence, no matter how obscure, to prove he was right. His mistake was built on three crucial miscalculations. First, he decided to find a smaller planet. He rejected the established calculations of Eratosthenes. Instead, he found the work of Ptolemy, another ancient geographer who had already underestimated the globe's size. Then, he compounded the error. He read the calculations of a 9th century Arab astronomer, Alfraganus. Alfraganus had calculated the length of a degree of longitude at the equator and was, in fact, quite accurate. But he wrote his measurements in Arabic miles. When Columbus read a Latin translation of this work, he made a critical, convenient error. He assumed Alfraganus meant Roman miles, which were significantly shorter. With this one simple, flawed conversion, he effectively shaved 25% off the planet's waistline. In his mind, the Earth became a much smaller, more manageable globe. Second, he needed to stretch Asia. If the globe was smaller, he now needed to make the landmass of Eurasia bigger, stretching it farther east until it almost touched Europe from the other side. For this, he turned to one of the most exciting books of his time, The Travels of Marco Polo. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, had described the court of the Great Khan and the wonders of Cathay. But he had also written of Cipangu, Japan. Crucially, he described Cipangu as lying 100 miles off the coast of China. Columbus seized on this. Then he exaggerated Marco Polo's already exaggerated distances. He argued that the landmass of Asia extended so far east that Japan would be the first land a sailor would encounter sailing west from Europe. He now had his two core mistakes: a smaller Earth and a massively oversized Asia. Third, he put them together. He received a map from a Florentine scholar named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who, like Columbus, was a believer in the Western Passage. This map, which is now lost but which Columbus carried in his mind, showed the Atlantic as a narrow, manageable sea. Let us be clear about the scale of this mathematical mistake. The best geographers in Portugal knew the true distance from the Canary Islands west to the coast of Asia was roughly 12,000 nautical miles. Christopher Columbus, by combining his smaller planet with his fatter Asia, calculated the distance to Cipangu, Japan, to be only 2,400 miles. This is the single most important fact of his story. His obsession was not fueled by a blind, irrational faith. It was fueled by a number. He wasn't proposing a voyage into an endless unknown. He was pitching a business plan, a shortcut, A journey he believed would take about 3 to 4 weeks. He had transformed an impossible multi-month voyage into a plausible, direct route to riches. This error was the engine of his obsession. It made him impervious to criticism. When the learned scholars in the Portuguese court, the greatest navigational minds in the world, told him his math was wrong, he didn't listen. He was not a man to be swayed by their facts. He had his own facts, cobbled together from ancient texts, wishful thinking, and a profound misreading of a single Arabic word. He also had his faith. He was a deeply, mystically religious man. His own name, Cristoforo, meant Christ-bearer. He came to see this enterprise as more than a route to gold. It was a divine mission. He believed he had been chosen by God to carry the light of Christianity across this small ocean sea, to the heathen lands of the East. This combination was potent. The rugged, self-taught experience of a Genoese sailor, the charismatic energy of a true believer, and a single, defining mathematical error that made it all seem not just possible, but destined. He was a man, armed with a map that showed a world that did not exist, fueled by a calculation that was profoundly, dangerously, and beautifully wrong. He had his plan. He had his numbers. He had his divine purpose. All he needed now was a patron. He needed a king or a queen, willing to gamble on his mistake. And so he began to knock on the doors of the most powerful people in Europe. And here our portrait of the man is complete. We leave him in Lisbon, a city buzzing with discovery, yet he is alone with his radical, flawed idea. His next journey will not be on water, but in the frustrating, gilded halls of power. Now let your mind hold this image of the man and his map, and rest. Welcome back. Let the world outside recede. Let the weight of your day lift and allow your mind to drift. Last time we gathered, we left a world on the brink, a Europe trapped by geography and history, desperate for a new way to the fabled riches of the East. The Portuguese, masters of the sea, had found their answer. A long, dangerous path south around the coast of Africa. The door was closing on all other nations, but in the shadows of this new reality there was a man. A man with a different map, a different calculation, and an unshakable, obsessive conviction. He was not a prince, nor a king, nor a great general. He was a Genoese weaver's son, a self-taught navigator who had become possessed by an idea so simple and so profoundly wrong that it would change the shape of the world. His name was Christopher Columbus, and his enterprise of the Indies was not just a plan for a voyage. It was his entire life. Tonight, we follow this man not onto the open ocean, but into the one sea he could not conquer, the glittering, skeptical, and labyrinthine courts of European royalty. The royal rejection, a dream deferred in the courts of Europe. To understand the rejections Columbus faced, we must first understand the man and his enterprise. He was not just a sailor. He was a master cartographer, a reader of ancient texts, and, above all, a brilliant salesman. He was charismatic, intense, and possessed a near-messianic belief in his own destiny. His plan, which he called Empresa de las Indias, or the Enterprise of the Indies, was beautifully simple. The world, he argued, and all educated people of the 15th century agreed, was a sphere. Therefore, to reach the East, one did not need to sail south around Africa. One could simply sail west. The simplicity was the hook. The problem was the math. Columbus's entire plan rested on one monumental, magnificent mistake. He believed the world was small, fantastically small. He had pieced together his own geography from a cocktail of sources. He took the calculations of Ptolemy, who had already underestimated the globe's size. Then he added the wild exaggerations of Marco Polo, who had described Asia as stretching impossibly far to the east. Finally, he leaned on the theories of the Florentine scholar Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who had also argued for a western passage. The result of this selective, optimistic math? Columbus believed Japan, or Kipangu as he called it, was not 12,000 miles to the west, but a mere 2,400. He wasn't proposing a journey into an endless, unknown void. He was pitching a shortcut. He was selling a direct 3-week voyage from the Canary Islands to the golden-roofed palaces of Asia. This was his crucial error, and it was the only reason his plan seemed feasible. His first, most logical stop was the Kingdom of Portugal. In 1484, he presented his idea to King John II. This was the absolute worst place for Columbus to be. Why? Because the Portuguese were the only people in Europe who actually knew he was wrong. Lisbon was the 15th century equivalent of NASA's mission control. It was the world's epicenter of navigation, mathematics, and oceanic exploration. King John, himself an astute and ambitious monarch, didn't just laugh Columbus out of the room. He did what any good executive would do. He referred the proposal to his committee of experts, the Junta dos Matemáticos. These were the finest mathematical minds of the age. They listened patiently to the charismatic Genoese. They examined his maps, they checked his figures, and they returned with a polite but devastating verdict. The man was a fool. They didn't reject his idea that the world was round. They rejected his numbers. They knew from their own far more accurate calculations that the Atlantic Ocean was vastly, terrifyingly wider than Columbus claimed. They told the king that any ship attempting this enterprise would sail west for months and find nothing but endless water. The crew would starve, the ships would be lost, and the entire venture would be a catastrophic waste of resources. And besides, King John had a far better bet. At that very moment, his own captain, Bartolomeo Diaz, was battling his way down the African coast. Why gamble on a madman's fantasy when a proven, methodical route was about to be opened? The Portuguese rejection was swift, scientific, and total. Columbus's dream was deferred. Humiliated and with his personal life in disarray after the death of his wife, Columbus left Portugal. In 1485, he took his young son, Diego, and crossed the border into the neighboring Kingdom of Spain. He arrived not in a unified, confident Spain, but in a nation fighting for its very soul. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were united only by the marriage of their two fiery monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. Their entire national treasury, their military and their spiritual energy were focused on one single, all-consuming goal: the Reconquista. For nearly 700 years, Christian kingdoms had fought to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Moorish caliphates. Now only one stronghold remained, the magnificent, opulent kingdom of Granada in the south. This was the court Columbus entered. It was a military camp, a kingdom on the move, obsessed with siege warfare and religious zeal. And into this high-stakes martial world walked a mapmaker with a strange idea about sailing west. He spent years as a court follower, a supplicant living on the margins of power. He used his charisma to win influential friends, dukes, friars, and royal treasurers, who saw a spark of genius or perhaps opportunity in his wild-eyed plan. Finally, in 1486, he was granted an audience. Ferdinand, a pragmatist, was skeptical. The war was too expensive to fund side projects. But Isabella, a woman of profound, almost mystical religious faith, was intrigued. There was something in Columbus's zeal that resonated with her own. But like the Portuguese king, she too referred him to a commission. This one was led by her own confessor, Hernando de Talavera. Once again, Columbus stood before a panel of scholars, churchmen, and astronomers. And once again he was met with the same crushing, logical rebuttal. His math was wrong. The ocean was too big. The enterprise was, in their learned opinion, vain and impractical. But the Spanish, unlike the Portuguese, did not give him a hard no. They were, after all, in a bitter rivalry with Portugal. The idea of a shortcut, however slim the chance, was tempting. And so, they gave him the most soul-crushing answer of all. Wait. They told him to wait until the war with Granada was over. Then perhaps they would have the time and the money to reconsider. To keep him from taking his idea to a rival, they gave him a small royal stipend, just enough to live on. And so, Columbus waited. For 6 long, agonizing years, his dream was deferred. He was a man in limbo, a known figure in the Spanish court pointed to as the man with the enterprise, a curiosity, a crank. He watched his hair turn white, his prime years ticking away, while the Spanish monarchs focused on their war. During this endless wait, he did not stay idle. He knew the Spanish commission was unlikely to change its mind. He dispatched his brother Bartholomew, also a skilled cartographer, to carry the enterprise to the other great courts of Europe. Bartholomew traveled to London to petition King Henry VII of England. But Henry Tudor was the most famously frugal king in English history. He had just won the bloody Wars of the Roses, secured a fragile crown, and was now meticulously rebuilding a bankrupted treasury. He was a man who counted every penny. The idea of funding a wildly expensive, high-risk, low-probability voyage, based on what his advisors also told him, was fantasy mathematics, held zero appeal. The English rejection was a no of cold, hard accounting. Bartholomew also tried the court of King Charles VIII of France. The French were more receptive to the idea, but their attention and their treasury was pointed in a different direction. They were dreaming of military glory not in the West but in the South, plotting a costly and complex invasion of Italy. The timing was wrong. The French too demurred. Every door was now closed. The experts in Portugal, the frugal accountants in England, the distracted warriors in France, and the preoccupied scholars in Spain had all, for their own logical reasons, rejected him. It was now January of 1492. The waiting was finally over. The last Moorish king of Granada had surrendered. The Reconquista was complete. Columbus, now 41 years old, his face weathered by sun and disappointment, rode to the new court at Santa Fe just outside the conquered city. He arrived expecting, at last, to receive his yes. Instead, the Talavera Commission gave its final, definitive report. No. The war was over. But their answer was the same. The project was a fantasy. The risks were too great. The rewards too uncertain. The man's demands too arrogant. He was asking for the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea and 10% of all riches from lands he might find. The rejection was absolute. This was the end. His dream, deferred for nearly a decade, was now officially dead. He had pitched his enterprise to every major power in the known world, and all had found it in him wanting, defeated, broke, and with nothing left to show for his life's work. Christopher Columbus saddled his mule and began the lonely ride out of Santa Fe. He was leaving Spain for good, perhaps to try his luck in France, or perhaps to simply fade into obscurity. As he rode away, he was a failure, a man whose great idea had been rejected by the entire world. But in the annals of history, a story is never over until the last person has spoken. And as Columbus rode toward the hills, one of his last remaining supporters, the royal treasurer Luis de Santangel, was racing through the halls of the palace, demanding one last, urgent audience with the only person who had ever truly felt the pull of his vision, Queen Isabella. The dream was not dead. It was just one conversation away from changing the world. And there we leave him, On the road to nowhere, at the absolute lowest point of his long and frustrating campaign, the courts have spoken. The dream is over. Now let your mind rest on that image of a man against the world, and sleep. Welcome back. Settle into your space. Let the noise of your world fade to a distant hum. We are returning to a story, not of maps or mathematics, but of human will, faith, and the volatile moment where desperation meets opportunity. Last time, we left a man at his lowest point. It was January of 1492. After 7 years of pleading, his enterprise of the Indies had been given its final, crushing rejection by the Spanish Commission. His math was declared flawed, his demands arrogant, his dream impossible. We left him on a dusty road, a failure, riding a mule out of the royal camp at Santa Fe, his life's work in ruins. But the man had left behind a city that was vibrating with victory. The air was not filled with the mundane concerns of scholarly debate. It was electric with triumph. After nearly 8 centuries, the last Moorish stronghold, the magnificent kingdom of Granada, had fallen. The Reconquista was over. For King Ferdinand of Aragon, this was a strategic and political masterpiece. For his wife, Queen Isabella of Castile, it was something far more profound. It was a miracle. It was divine proof that she and her kingdom were the chosen instruments of God's will. It is in this precise, supercharged moment, a moment of ultimate triumph and the profound question of what next, that our story pivots. A dream that was dead is about to be resurrected, not by the man on the mule, but by the men who had stayed behind. Isabella's gamble. A queen's faith changes history. As Columbus's mule plodded patiently toward the hills, a different kind of race was happening within the walls of the newly captured Alhambra Palace. A man running against time was seeking an urgent last-ditch audience with the Queen. This man was not a sailor or a scholar. He was Luis de Santangel, the keeper of the royal purse for the Kingdom of Aragon. He was a converso, a man from a prominent Jewish family who had converted to Christianity, and he was one of the most brilliant and pragmatic financiers in Spain. He had helped find the money to fund the long, grinding war against Granada. He was not a dreamer. He was an investor, and he saw something the scholarly commission had missed. He bypassed the skeptical advisors, the friars, and the astronomers who had just dismissed Columbus, and he went straight to the monarchs. He found Ferdinand and Isabella together, still savoring their monumental victory. He was, historians believe, joined by other court insiders who had also been swayed by the Genoese navigator, Santangel. With the desperate energy of a man watching a massive opportunity walk out the door, began his pitch. He didn't just appeal to them. He framed the entire enterprise in a new light, changing it from an academic's folly into a high-stakes geopolitical necessity. First, he spoke to the man of strategy, King Ferdinand. "Your Majesty," we can imagine him arguing, "the Commission of Scholars speaks of risk. Let us speak of certainty. The certainty is that Portugal is on the verge of winning everything. Their ships have rounded Africa. At this very moment, they are likely on their way to India. In a few years, Lisbon will be the wealthiest port in the world. The spice trade, the gold of the Indies, it will all flow to them. And we, fresh from our great victory, will be a poor kingdom on the edge of Europe, locked out of the world's wealth." He let the silence hang. Ferdinand, the ultimate pragmatist, he knew this was true. The rivalry with Portugal was the defining political reality of his reign. "This man, this Colombo," Santangel continued, "he is eccentric. His maps are optimistic. The scholars say he is a fool. Perhaps he is. But what if he is not? What if his simple westward route is the one God intended? We are not just letting him go. We are letting his idea go. He will walk from here to the King of France or to England. They will grow desperate enough to fund him, and if he is right, we will have the eternal shame of having handed the keys to the world to our greatest rivals. For what, to save a pittance? This was Santangel's masterstroke. He now turned to the second and most potent argument, the cost. The commission, he pressed, warns of the great expense. But what is the expense? I am your treasurer. I know the cost. He asks for 2, perhaps 3 small ships. He asks for a crew. The entire venture can be financed for less than 2 million maravedis. Your Majesties, we have just spent hundreds of millions conquering Granada. This great expense is a rounding error. It is the cost of a few days of war. It is nothing. He had transformed the debate. It was no longer a question of can we afford to do this, but can we afford not to? It was an asymmetrical bet. The downside was tiny, the loss of a few ships and a small sum of money, a pittance that would be forgotten in a year. The upside, however, was limitless. It was, quite literally, the world. Now, Santangel turned to the Queen. He knew Ferdinand saw the logic of the gamble, but he needed Isabella's moral fire. My Queen, he said, his voice softening, you are God's chosen vessel. You have just purified this great land, returning it to the cross. Your victory here in Granada is the talk of the Christian world. What if this is God's next task for you? What if this man, whose very name means Christ-bearer, has been sent to you at this exact moment of your triumph to offer you a new crusade? He was echoing Columbus's own messianic sales pitch. Think of the millions of souls in the Indies who live in darkness, who have never heard the Gospels. Think of the gold of Cathay, not for our own coffers, but to fund the final great crusade you have always dreamed of. To sail east and reclaim Jerusalem itself. This was the turning point. For Ferdinand, it was a cold, brilliant calculation of risk versus reward. For Isabella, it was a divine mandate. The Reconquista was finished. The mission to evangelize the world was about to begin. The popular legend, born centuries later, claims that Queen Isabella, in a fit of pious fervor, offered to pawn her own personal jewels to fund the voyage. It is a beautiful story, but it is a myth. The truth is far more practical. Louis de Santangel, the man making the argument, was the man who held the purse strings. He told the monarchs, you do not need to risk your own treasury. The funds are available. I will help advance a large portion of the sum myself, from the treasuries of Aragon. The rest would be arranged from royal funds he managed and, crucially, from other Genoese and Florentine bankers based in Spain, who were just as desperate as Columbus to find a new trade route and break the Portuguese-Venetian stranglehold. The decision was made. The scholarly no was overruled by a royal yes. Queen Isabella, her mind made up, gave the order. Send a messenger. Send him now. Find that man and bring him back. A royal marshal was dispatched at a full gallop. He thundered down the road out of Santa Fe, eating up the miles. He found Columbus a few miles away at a small bridge now known as the Bridge of the Pines. The dejected navigator, his mule plodding towards a future of obscurity, was stunned to see the royal standard flying toward him. The marshal reined in his horse. Señor Colombo, you are to return. The Queen commands it. Columbus turned his mule around. He rode back, not as a beggar, but as a man who knew after 7 years that his moment had finally come. He knew he had won. When he returned to court, he did not fall to his knees in gratitude. He stood tall and doubled down on his arrogant demands. The very demands that had so horrified the Royal Commission. He demanded to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He demanded to be Viceroy and Governor General of all lands he discovered. And most audaciously of all, he demanded the 10th, the diezmo, 10% of all gold, silver, pearls, spices, and any other tradable goods found in these new lands, for himself and his heirs in perpetuity. Ferdinand was enraged. This was an insult. He was granting this commoner, this weaver's son, the status of a high grandee of Spain for a voyage that would likely end in disaster. He was on the verge of canceling the entire project over the man's sheer audacity. But again, the pragmatists stepped in. "Your Majesty," they likely argued, "let him have what he asks. What is 10% of nothing if he fails and sinks to the bottom of the sea? And if he succeeds, if he truly finds a new route to the Indies, the 90% that remains for the crown of Spain will be a wealth so vast it is unimaginable. Let him have his titles. They are just words." Ferdinand, swallowing his pride, agreed. On April 17, 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. It was a contract that effectively gave a private citizen a blank check for an empire that did not exist. The gamble was on. The impossible voyage was funded. It was a decision born not of science or reason or consensus. It was a perfect storm of religious fervor, cutthroat geopolitical rivalry, a treasurer's clear-eyed understanding of risk, and the unshakable messianic and mathematically flawed obsession of a single man. The port of Palos de la Frontera was chosen. 3 small aging ships, 2 caravels, and a larger nau were requisitioned. The money was released. The search for a crew willing to sail off the edge of the world began, and so the gamble was taken. The Queen's faith, the King's calculation, and the treasurer's cash had all aligned. A man who was a failure just days before was now an admiral, and 3 small ships were being prepared for a journey that no one, not even Columbus himself, could possibly comprehend. Now let your mind rest on that turning point, on that single history-altering yes, and sleep. Welcome back. Find your stillness. Let the tension in your shoulders and your jaw release. You are not here. You are drifting back in time to a place of profound and terrifying isolation. Last time we were in the court of Spain, we witnessed the impossible. A queen's faith, a treasurer's logic, and a king's grudging calculation all aligned. A failed navigator, his dream dead on the road, was called back. He was given his titles, his contract, and his ships. The enterprise of the Indies was no longer a madman's fantasy. It was a royal-sanctioned quest. But the royal signature on a piece of paper is a fragile thing against the power of the open ocean. Now we leave the safety of the court. We leave the land itself. We join the admiral and his terrified crew on 3 small ships, sailing against the edge of the known world. And into the void. 3 ships against the unknown. Mutiny on the Atlantic. The fleet assembled at the port of Palos de la Frontera was not a grand imperial armada. It was humble, even unimpressive. 3 vessels, small and weathered, were pulled from the harbor. The flagship was the Santa Maria. She was a nau, a single-decked merchant ship, heavy, round-bottomed, and slow. She was the largest of the 3, but a clumsy sailor, and Columbus, a man of caravels, disliked her from the start. The other 2 were the ships of the age, caravels. They were the Porsches of the 15th century, light, fast, and agile. The Pinta, the fastest of all, was captained by a fierce and respected local sailor named Martin Alonso Pinzon. The smallest, the Niña, the little girl, was captained by Martin's brother, the steadfast Vicente Yanez Pinzon. And the crew? Legend paints them as criminals and gutter scraps, men released from prison to die in a fool's quest. The truth is more complex. The town of Palos owed a debt to the crown, and was ordered to provide these ships and men. While some sailors may have been pardoned for minor offenses, the vast majority were seasoned professional mariners. They were the toughest sailors in Spain, men who knew the Atlantic's moods, but they were recruited by the Pinzon brothers, not by Columbus. The men of Palos would not have sailed with this strange white-haired Genoese visionary. They sailed because the Pinzons, their neighbors, their captains, their friends, staked their own lives and fortunes on the voyage. On August 3, 1492, before the sun rose, the town of Palos gathered at the church. 90 men, sailors, a ship's doctor, a translator who spoke Arabic and Hebrew, in case they met the Great Khan, and a royal comptroller to count the gold, all took communion. They said their goodbyes to their wives and children. Many, perhaps most, believed it was for the last time. Then in the half-light of dawn, the 3 small ships hoisted their sails, caught the tide, and slipped out of the harbor. Their first leg was not into the unknown, but to a familiar Spanish outpost, the Canary Islands. This was the last stop, the final edge of the known world. They spent nearly a month there, repairing the Pinta's broken rudder, taking on the last loads of fresh water, firewood, and salted meat. Then, on September 6, 1492, the real journey began. They sailed west from the island of La Gomera. The crew watched as the last peak of land, the volcano on Tenerife, grew smaller and smaller, and then vanished. For the first time in their lives, and for the first time in the history of European navigation, they were truly, utterly lost on purpose. There was no coastline to follow, no port to aim for. There was only the sun, the stars, and the Admiral's promise. To manage the inevitable fear, Columbus employed a clever deception. He kept 2 logbooks. One, which he showed to the crew, deliberately underreported the miles they sailed each day. He wanted them to believe they were closer to home than they truly were. The second log, his private secret one, held his true calculations, his record of just how far into the void he was leading them. At first, the sailing was miraculously easy. They had picked up the trade winds, a powerful, steady wind that blew constantly perfectly to the west. But this perfect wind soon became a new source of terror. The sailors began to murmur, "This wind, it only blows one way. It pushes us west, but it will never let us return. We can never sail home against it." They were sailing into a one-way trap. Then they sailed into a sea that shouldn't exist. For days on end, the ships were becalmed in a vast floating meadow of yellow-green seaweed that stretched to every horizon. The Sargasso Sea. The water was thick with it. The crew was horrified. Ancient legends told of a green maze at the edge of the world, a place where ships were tangled, held fast, and left to rot, their crews starving to death. They were trapped, becalmed in the middle of nowhere. It took days, but the wind finally picked them up again. But then another terror. One night the navigators looked at their compasses. The needle, which had always pointed faithfully to the North Star, was now shifting. It was pointing several degrees away from the star. We now know this as magnetic declination, a natural variation, but to them it was a supernatural nightmare. The very laws of God and nature were breaking down. The tools they trusted with their lives were failing them, and still there was no land. Columbus had pitched a 2,400-mile voyage. They had now sailed past that. They had sailed 2,700 miles, 3,000 miles. They were in a part of the ocean no map had ever drawn. Tierra. Tierra. The cry would come from the lookout. "Land, land!" The Pinta, the fastest ship, would fire its small cannon. The fleet's morale would soar. They would change course, sailing frantically toward a bank of low-lying clouds, or a flock of birds that looked like a shadow on the horizon. Each false dawn, each illusory landfall chipped away at their hope, replacing it with a cold, simmering anger. The Admiral was a fraud. The Queen was a fool. And they were all dead men. In early October, after more than 30 days without sight of land, the simmering anger boiled over. The men had had enough. The crew of the Santa Maria gathered on the deck. They confronted Columbus. This was not a polite negotiation. It was a mutiny. We can imagine the scene. Hardened, bearded sailors, their faces burned by the sun, their eyes wide with fear and rage, surrounding the lone, foreign admiral. "We are turning back," they told him. "You have led us here to die. We will sail west no longer." The threat was clear. "Turn the ships or we will throw you into the sea and sail home without you. We will tell the Queen you fell overboard while reading your stars." This was the moment. The entire enterprise of the Indies was balanced on the knife edge of this single confrontation. Columbus, the salesman, the true believer, had to make the most important pitch of his life. He could not fight them. He could not imprison them. He had to persuade them, he reasoned. He pleaded. He pointed to new signs, different signs, not just weeds and birds. In the last few days they had seen signs that could only come from land. They had pulled a floating branch from the water, and it had fresh live berries on it. They had found a carved piece of wood, a reed, a small plank. These things had not been floating for months. They were new. "I know we are close," he argued, his messianic certainty burning in his eyes. He then made his final desperate bargain. "Give me 3 more days," he begged. "Just 3. Sail with me for 3 more days. If we do not find land in that time, I will give the order. I will do as you ask, and we will turn for home." The mutiny wavered. The men looked to Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta. He was their true leader. Pinzon, too, was on edge, but he saw the logic in the new signs. He nodded. The bargain was struck. 3 days. The tension on the ships was unbearable. October 9th. Nothing. October 10th. Nothing, just the endless empty horizon. October 11th. They sailed all day, the trade wind strong at their backs. The mood was dark. The 3 days were almost up. That night on the 11th of October, Columbus stood on the high stern castle of the Santa Maria, peering into the blackness. Around 10 p.m. he thought he saw it, a light. "Like a small wax candle," he wrote, "rising and falling." It was faint, indistinct. He called 2 others to look. One saw it, one did not. Was it another illusion? He ordered the night watch to be vigilant. The Pinta, the fastest ship, sailed ahead in the darkness. On her forecastle stood a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana. At 2 a.m. on the morning of October 12, 1492, Rodrigo strained his eyes against the dark. This was it, the last watch of the last day, and then he saw it. Not a cloud, not a shadow, but a line of white gleaming in the moonlight. A white cliff or a pale sandy beach. It was unmistakable. He drew a breath and screamed the 2 words that would shatter the silence and change the world forever. Tierra. Tierra! A cannon boomed from the Pinta's deck, the signal echoing across the water. On the Santa Maria and the Niña, sleeping men burst onto the decks shouting, weeping, embracing, falling to their knees in prayer. The mutiny, the terror, the weeks of crushing doubt, all vanished in a single explosive moment of joy. They were alive. They had done it. Christopher Columbus, the man who was a madman just hours before, was now the greatest hero of the age. He had done the impossible. He had sailed west and found land. As the sun rose, they saw before them a small, flat island covered in green trees. It was not the golden-roofed palaces of Japan. It was not the teeming ports of China. He had no idea where he was. But he had arrived. They had found it. Or rather, they had found something. The greatest error in history had led to its greatest discovery. But the men on those ships had no idea what they had truly done. They believed they were in the Indies. They were about to step ashore into a world they could not comprehend. And now, let your mind rest on that shore. And sleep. Welcome back. Let your body grow heavy, your mind light. Let the sounds of your room fade into the background. You are here for the end of one story and the beginning of another. We left our sailors at the very peak of human emotion. It was 2 a.m. A cannon shot from the Pinta had just shattered the night, and a single desperate cry, "Tierra! Tierra!" had turned a crew of condemned mutineers into conquering heroes. The terror of the void was broken. The mutiny was forgotten. They had done the impossible, but now they waited. The ships lowered their sails, slowing to a halt, bobbing on the dark, gentle swell. They were too afraid to approach an unknown shore in the black of night. So they waited for the dawn, and that perhaps was the longest, most agonizing wait of all. 90 men, crowded on the decks, staring at a dark, indistinct line on the western horizon. They had sailed 33 days from the Canary Islands. They had sailed 3,000 miles into a world no one believed existed. And now they just waited. Tierra! Tierra! First contact in a new world. As the first pale gray light of Friday, October 12, 1492 began to touch the sky, the world was painted back into existence. The light revealed not the golden-roofed palaces of Chipangu, Japan, nor the bustling, silk-laden ports of Cathay, China. What they saw was something else entirely. It was a small, flat island, covered from shore to shore in a dense green forest that seemed impossibly lush. A strip of brilliant white sand ringed the island, and the water inside its reef was a calm crystalline turquoise that shimmered with colors they had never seen. It was beautiful. It was pristine. And it was not Asia. But before that confusion could even set in, they saw something else. As the sun rose, figures emerged from the trees onto the beach. People. They were naked, their skin a coppery brown, and they were running along the shore, pointing in stunned disbelief at the 3 massive, winged houses that had mysteriously appeared in their waters. From the shore, the Taino people stared at the ships. From the ships, the Spanish sailors stared at the Taino. For a long, silent moment, 2 separate and complete worlds, which had existed for millennia without knowledge of the other, simply gazed. The enterprise of the Indies was about to become the collision of 2 planets. Christopher Columbus, ever the man of destiny, was not going to meet this new world as a simple sailor. He was an admiral, a viceroy. He ordered the ship's boats to be lowered. He dressed himself in his finest scarlet cloak. He, along with the Pinzon brothers, Martin and Vicente, captains of the Pinta and Nina, prepared to go ashore. They were armed, not just with swords, but with symbols. They carried the royal standards of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, heavy banners of silk and thread. As the boats crunched onto the white sand of the island the natives called Guanahani, Columbus was the first to step out. Imagine that moment. The feeling of solid, damp sand under his boot after 33 days of a heaving wooden deck. The smell of the air, not just salt, but damp earth. An overwhelming perfume of unknown flowers, and the smoke from the natives' morning fires. He and his men fell to their knees. They kissed the ground. They wept, openly and without shame. The raw, explosive relief of men who had been to the edge of death and returned. Then, the admiral stood. He drew his sword, and as his men watched, he performed a strange and solemn ritual. He planted the royal banners in the wet sand. He was joined by the royal comptroller, Rodrigo de Escobedo, who brought a pen and paper, and there, on a beach populated by a handful of stunned, naked onlookers who understood not one word, Christopher Columbus began to speak. He delivered a formal, legalistic proclamation in Spanish. He declared that this island, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, was now the property of the King and Queen of Spain. He gave it a new name, San Salvador, or Holy Savior, for it had been their salvation. The native Taino people, who had emerged cautiously from the trees, watched this baffling ceremony. They saw men in strange, heavy clothes covered in hair, planting colorful sticks in the sand and speaking in loud, harsh tones to the sky. They had no concept of kings or Spain or owning the land. They were, as Columbus himself would write in his log that night, a people of profound innocence. When the ceremony was over, the encounter began. The Taino, Columbus wrote, were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They were painted in black, red, and white. They were, to the shock of the Europeans, all naked as their mothers bore them, and they were not afraid. They were curious. They slowly approached the strange pale visitors. They came as if greeting beings who had descended from the sky. They touched the sailors' beards. They marveled at the heavy wool and velvet of their clothes. Columbus, ever the salesman, understood the power of a first impression. He ordered his men to offer gifts. He had brought a chest full of trade trinkets, things of near worthlessness in Europe that would be, he gambled, treasures here. And he was right. He offered them small red caps, strands of glass beads, and tiny brass bells called hawk's bells used in falconry. The reaction was one of pure, unadulterated joy. The Taino had never seen clear manufactured glass. They had no metal at all. The sound of the tiny tinkling bells fascinated them. They held them to their ears, laughing. They eagerly strung the worthless glass beads around their necks, believing them to be jewels of incredible power. This first encounter was one of peace, of wonder, of mutual curiosity. The Taino, in return, offered what they had: balls of spun cotton thread, dried fruits, and brightly colored parrots that screeched in the trees. It was an innocent exchange, a bartering of wonder. But Columbus, the admiral and viceroy, was not just there for wonder. He was on a mission for profit, and his eyes, scanning the crowd, noticed something that made his heart leap. Hanging from the noses of a few of the natives were small, dull, beaten ornaments. It was gold. In that moment, his entire flawed, mistaken theory was, in his mind, completely vindicated. He was not in Asia, but he must be near it. He was in the Indies, and these people were Indians. This, he was sure, was an outlying island of the vast golden empire of the Great Khan. He tried to ask them about the gold. Using frantic hand gestures, pointing to the gold, pointing to the ground, pointing to his ships, he asked, "Where does this come from?" The Taino, likely just as confused, gestured vaguely to the south. There was, they seemed to say, a great land in that direction, and a fierce people, who they called the Carib, who sometimes raided them. In that single misunderstood exchange, the fate of the Caribbean was sealed. Columbus was not interested in San Salvador. It was a beautiful green stopping point, but his mind was now fixed on the horizon on the south, where the real prize, the gold mines of Japan and the cities of China, surely lay. He also made another observation, one that he recorded in his journal that very night. It is perhaps the most chilling and prophetic sentence of the entire encounter. He looked at their weapons, simple wooden spears, hardened in the fire and tipped with a sharp fish tooth. He noted their gentleness, their total lack of iron, their innocence of European-style conflict. "They bear no arms," he wrote, "and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." The first day of contact, a day that began in weeping relief and was spent in mutual wonder, ended with this cold calculation. As the sun set on October 12, 1492, the Taino paddled their canoas, dugout canoes, back to the shore, their hands full of bells and beads. The Spanish rowed back to their ships, their hands full of parrots and cotton, their minds full of one single, intoxicating thought: gold. A new world had been found. Not by science, not by skill, but by a profound and world-changing mathematical mistake. And now, the true search, the true enterprise was about to begin. A new world, a new people, and a new terrible hunger. The first contact is over, but the journey of the Admiral has just begun. He is convinced he is in the Indies, and he will now stop at nothing to find the source of that gold. And so, let your mind drift on that turquoise water and rest. Welcome back, settle in. Let the distractions of your day begin to feel distant, unimportant. Let your mind become as calm and open as the turquoise water we are drifting upon. Last time we stood on the beach of a new world. We witnessed the first contact, a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder, of two halves of a planet gazing at each other for the very first time. We saw the joy of the Taino people, delighted by worthless glass beads and tiny bells, and we saw the cold, calculating mind of the Admiral who, in that very first encounter, noticed two things that would define the future: their gentle, trusting nature, and the small, gleaming ornaments of gold they wore in their noses. That first day on the island he named San Salvador was a day of profound relief. But it was not the end of the mission. It was the beginning. For Christopher Columbus, this beautiful island was not the prize. It was merely the doorstep. His mind was not on what he had found, but on what he was seeking. In search of the great Khan, the grand illusion. The joy of landfall faded quickly, replaced by the familiar burning fire of the Admiral's obsession. He was not an explorer in the way we think of one. He was not there to chart the unknown. He was a man with a map drawn from the works of Marco Polo and Ptolemy, and he was now desperately trying to make this new, green, vibrant reality fit the map in his head. He was in the Indies. These people were Indians. Therefore, the gold, the spices, and the palaces of the great Khan must be nearby. He did not linger on San Salvador. After a few days, he ordered the anchors weighed, but he did not leave alone. In a move that signaled the future, he had several of the gentle Taino seized and brought aboard his ships. They were not guests. They were prisoners forced to become guides, to point the way to the source of the gold. With his new, terrified guides pointing, the three ships sailed south, navigating a pristine, glittering archipelago of islands, what we now call the Bahamas. Each island was a new discovery, a new paradise. The crew was ecstatic, marveling at the sweet-smelling air, the flocks of colorful parrots that seemed to blot out the sun, the crystalline water. But Columbus was not enchanted. He was frustrated. Each island was the same. Small villages of thatched huts, friendly people with little to trade but cotton and parrots, and only the tiniest trace amounts of gold. His logbook from these days is the journal of a man possessed by a single thought. He is not describing what he sees. He is describing what he wants to see. He writes of the air being full of the scent of spices, though he finds no spice trees. He convinces himself that every unfamiliar plant must be a valuable Eastern commodity. He is a man projecting his dream onto a world that refuses to conform. Then his Taino guides, through desperate gestures, told him of a vast land to the south. A land they called Kolba. It was so large, they gestured, that you could not see its end. This was it. The word Kolba echoed in his mind, and it clicked. Chipangu, Japan. The fabled island of Marco Polo, the one described as having palaces roofed in pure gold. It had to be. On October 28, 1492, his small fleet entered a deep, beautiful harbor on the coast of the most magnificent land he had yet seen. This was Cuba. It was impossibly vast, green, and mountainous. "I have never seen anything so beautiful," he wrote to the king and queen. "This is the most beautiful land that human eyes have ever seen. Surely, a land this majestic must be the continent of Asia, or the Golden Island of Japan." The great Khan could not be far. He sailed along the coast looking for the great cities. He found none. He saw only small peaceful villages nestled in river valleys. The people were the same as those on San Salvador, though perhaps more advanced. They lived in large, well-built communal houses. But there were no golden roofs. There were no silk-robed merchants. The grand illusion was beginning to crack, but Columbus's self-belief was a fortress. He reasoned that he had merely landed on a poor outer province of the empire. The capital, the court of the great Khan, must be just inland. He decided to send an embassy. This moment is one of the most bizarre and poignant of the entire voyage. He chose 2 men for the mission: Rodrigo de Jerez, a sailor, and crucially Luis de Torres. Torres was the fleet's translator, a converso who had been hired specifically because he spoke Arabic, Hebrew, and Chaldean, the languages Columbus believed would be useful in the court of Asia. These 2 men, armed with their European clothes, a string of glass beads as a gift, and a royal letter of introduction to the great Khan, set off into the jungle of Cuba. They marched for several days, following a small path until they came to the largest city the locals knew. What they found was not a new Beijing. It was a village of about 50 large thatched huts. They were greeted by the Taino with great ceremony and honor, fed and housed. They tried to communicate. Luis de Torres spoke his formal Arabic to the village chief. The Taino, of course, stared back in blank confusion. There was no Khan, there was no gold. There were no spices. The embassy was a total failure. But as they returned to the ships, de Jerez and de Torres reported seeing something extraordinary, a strange local custom. The natives, they said, would take a dried, rolled-up sheaf of leaves, light one end on fire, and drink the smoke from the other. The Taino called these rolled leaves tobaccos. It was the first time Europeans had ever witnessed smoking. Columbus noted it in his log, but he was utterly unimpressed. It was a savage custom with no value. He had come for gold, not for dried leaves. He had failed to find the Khan, and he was growing desperate. It was at this moment of deep frustration that his small fleet faced a crisis. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta, was an ambitious and skilled sailor. He was also growing tired of the admiral's obsessive, fruitless search for a non-existent emperor. Pinzon had been speaking to the Taino on his own, and he had heard his own rumors, whispers of a different island. To the east, a place called Babec where, the natives insisted, the people gathered gold from the sand with torches at night. On November 21st, Pinzon made his move. Citing bad weather as an excuse, he simply sailed the Pinta away from the other 2 ships. He did not ask for permission. He did not wait. He simply left. It was an act of pure insubordination, a mutiny of one. Columbus was enraged. He was left with only his own clumsy flagship, the Santa Maria, and the tiny Nina. He was terrified, abandoned in an unknown world by his best ship and his most experienced captain. He cursed Pinzon in his log, calling him a traitor, but there was nothing he could do. He abandoned his search for the great Khan in Cuba and turned his 2 remaining ships east, into the wind, to go in search of Pinzon and in search of this new, mythical island of Babeque. After a difficult journey, he did not find Babeque. He found something else. On December 5th, he sighted another island, as large and as beautiful as Cuba, its mountains soaring into the clouds. He named it La Isla Española, the Spanish island, Hispaniola. And here everything changed. The Taíno people of Hispaniola were, like the others, gentle and welcoming. But there was one crucial difference. They had gold. They had much more of it. They wore it in their ears and their noses on small bracelets. They brought it as gifts, beaten into small masks and ornaments. This was it. The illusion snapped back into place, stronger than ever. If Cuba was Chipangu, then this, Columbus decided, must be the land of Ophir, the legendary lost biblical land where King Solomon had sourced his great treasures. He befriended a powerful local cacique, chief, named Guacanagari, who ruled the stretch of coast where they anchored. The Taíno were deeply impressed, even frightened by the Spaniards' weapons. When Columbus fired one of his ship's cannons, the sound and shockwave sent the entire village scattering in terror. They were, Guacanagari explained, at war with a fierce people from other islands, the Caribs, who, he claimed, were cannibals. Columbus, ever the opportunist, promised Guacanagari that he and his men would protect them from the Caribs. The alliance was sealed. Guacanagari gave the admiral a magnificent gift, a belt and a mask both beautifully crafted and adorned with pieces of gold. The search was over. The hunt was successful. Columbus was anchored in a calm, beautiful bay, in the court of a friendly native king with tangible proof of gold in his hands. He had not found the Great Khan, but he had found the source of his wealth. The grand illusion was complete. He was in the Indies. He was rich. He had succeeded. He sat in his cabin on the Santa Maria, writing a triumphant, glowing report to the king and queen. He was, in this moment, the most successful man on earth, and in that moment of absolute triumph, as his ships lay in the peaceful starlit bay on Christmas Eve, disaster was about to strike. He had found his prize. The illusion was total. The mission in his mind was complete. He was an admiral not just in name, but in fact. And as he rested in the calm of that perfect tropical night, the next chapter of his journey was about to be written, not by a man, but by a hidden reef. And now let your mind drift on that calm, dark water, and rest. Welcome back. Let your body sink deep into your comfort. Let your thoughts unmoor themselves from the present day. You are drifting, not on a dark sea of sleep, but on a dark sea of history. We left our admiral at his absolute peak. His grand illusion was complete. He was anchored in a tropical paradise on the island he named Hispaniola. The treacherous Captain Pinzon was gone, but it no longer mattered. He had befriended the local king, Guacanagari. He had found gold. Not just traces, but meaningful amounts. He was, in his mind, in the land of Ophir, the biblical source of King Solomon's wealth. He had done it. It was Christmas Eve, 1492. The men were celebrating. After months of terror, uncertainty, and grinding work, the mission was a success. The air was calm, the sea was glass, and on the flagship, the Santa Maria, Admiral Christopher Columbus, the man who had not slept soundly in months, finally allowed himself to rest, shipwreck a fort, and the hero's triumphant return. As the admiral slept, the ship's watch officer, also exhausted and filled with festive relief, made a small human and catastrophic decision. The night was clear, the sea was flat. He saw no harm in handing the ship's tiller, its steering, to a young, inexperienced ship's boy, a grumete, while he stole a few moments of rest himself. The boy, holding the tiller, felt the ship moving gently on the slow, warm current. What no one could see, and what the calm sea disguised, was that this current was pushing them inch by inch toward the shore. There were no loud waves, no telltale roar of breakers to warn them. Around midnight on Christmas Day, the night was broken by a sound. It was not a violent crash. It was a slow, sickening wooden groan, a series of terrible grinding crunches. The Santa Maria was not sinking. She was stuck. She had been gently and fatally impaled on a hidden coral reef. Columbus was on deck in an instant, his triumph turned to ash. He shouted orders. "Cut the mast! Lighten the load!" He ordered the ship's longboat to be lowered, to row out and drop a heavy anchor astern, to try and winch the ship backward off the reef. The officer in charge of the boat, in a moment of pure panic, did not row astern. He and his men rowed away toward the only other ship, the tiny Nina, a quarter-mile off. They were saving their own lives. The Nina's captain, Vicente Pinzon, in a show of loyalty, refused to let the cowards on board. The longboat was forced to return, but it was far too late. The Santa Maria was lost. The tide was falling, and the heavy ship was now listing, her seams splitting, her hull broken on the coral. Dawn on Christmas Day revealed a scene of utter despair. Columbus, weeping on the deck of the Nina, was a broken man. His flagship was gone. The Pinta had deserted him. He was stranded thousands of miles from home with all his men and only one tiny caravel. It was not a fleet. It was a lifeboat. But then a strange and beautiful thing happened. His new friend, the chief Guacanagari, saw the disaster from the shore. He and his people did not attack. They came to help. The chief sent hundreds of his people out in large canoes. All day the Spanish and the Taino worked side by side. They emptied the dying ship. Casks of wine, barrels of hardtack, crossbows, cannons, trade goods, everything was ferried to the shore. And in this entire operation, Columbus wrote, such was the honesty and grief of the Taino people, that not a single nail was stolen. Guacanagari himself set up an armed guard around the salvaged goods. As Columbus stared at the pile of his belongings on that foreign beach, the eternal optimist, the salesman, took over. This was not a disaster. This, he reasoned, was providence. This was a sign from God. He was not meant to leave. He was meant to stay. He had a problem. Far too many men, far too little ship. He could not take all his men home on the tiny Nina. He would have to leave some behind. He looked at the broken hulk of the Santa Maria. It was not a wreck. It was timber. He gave the order. The Santa Maria was to be torn apart. Her planks, her ribs, her beams were all carried ashore. From the bones of his dead flagship, Columbus and his men built a new structure. It was a crude tower, a wooden fort surrounded by a palisade. They mounted the ship's cannons on its walls. A terrifying display of power for the Taino. They finished it in 10 days. And because it was born from the disaster of Christmas, Columbus named it La Navidad, the Nativity. It was the very first European settlement in the New World. He chose 39 men to stay. Their mission, to guard the fort, to learn the Taino language, and above all, to find the source of the gold mine. He left them with a year's worth of provisions, trade goods, and the ship's doctor. Then in the first days of 1493, the tiny Nina pointed her bow east for home. The 39 men stood on the shore, watching the sail of their only link to the known world disappear over the horizon. Just 2 days later, sailing along the coast, a lookout shouted, "A sail." It was the Pinta. Martin Alonso Pinzon, having found little gold on his own, sheepishly rejoined the admiral. Columbus was furious, but he was also a pragmatist. He was in no position to argue. He needed the second ship. The journey home was a nightmare. The easy trade winds that had pushed them west were now a relentless, ferocious headwind. They were forced to sail northeast into the cold, stormy heart of the winter Atlantic. In February, the ocean turned on them. A storm of unimaginable violence struck the two small ships. For days, they were tossed by waves the size of mountains. The sky was black. The Pinta, damaged, was lost in the darkness. The Nina was alone, and she was dying. Her tiny hull leaked. Her sails were shredded. The crew, screaming in terror, gave up all hope. Columbus, in the howling blackness, was certain he would die. But his greatest fear was not death. It was oblivion, that his discovery, his entire life's work, would be swallowed by the sea and the world would never know. He grabbed a piece of parchment. He scribbled a frantic summary of his voyage, a letter to his king and queen. He sealed it in a small wooden cask covered in wax, and, in a final act of desperation, he threw it into the ocean, praying that one day, perhaps in a century, it would wash ashore and tell his tale. But the Niña did not sink. Battered, waterlogged, and with a crew of half-dead men, she limped toward the first land they saw. It was the Azores, but it was not salvation. It was Portugal. The Portuguese governor, instantly suspicious, arrested half of Columbus's crew, believing he had been illegally trading in their African territories. It took days of tense negotiation, with Columbus brandishing his royal Spanish credentials to secure their release. He set sail again, only to be hit by a second hurricane. This one was even worse. It shredded his last sails and forced him, as a last resort, to seek shelter in the one port on earth he dreaded most: Lisbon, the capital of the kingdom that had called him a fool. The news spread. The man who had sailed west to find the Indies had returned. He was summoned before King John II. This was the ultimate vindication. Columbus, the rejected dreamer, now stood before the king, not as a beggar, but as a conqueror. He casually told the king of his shortcut. He showed him the Indians he had brought. King John, sick with humiliation, seeing the world and all its riches slip through his fingers, could do nothing but let him go, inally, on March 15, 1493. 7 months after he had left, the tiny, battered Niña limped back into the port of Palos. By an incredible coincidence, the shattered Pinta arrived in a nearby port on the very same day. The town of Palos erupted. The men they had mourned as dead were walking their streets. Columbus's journey to the royal court in Barcelona was not a trip. It was a victory parade. He was a Roman general returning from the conquest of a new world. He brought his trophies, 6 of the Taino dressed in native paint, cages of screeching, colorful parrots, strange unknown plants, and, most important, the proof: golden masks, golden coronets, and flasks of gold dust. He entered the royal hall. Ferdinand and Isabella, in a move that shattered centuries of protocol, did not let him kneel. They stood up. They commanded him, a weaver's son from Genoa, to sit beside them, the highest honor a subject could be paid. The scholars who had scoffed were silent. The courtiers who had mocked were now bowing. He told his story. He presented his Indians. He had found the Indies, he assured them. He had claimed a new golden world for Spain. He was Don Cristobal, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies. The Queen's gamble had paid off. He was, in that moment, the most famous, most celebrated, and most powerful man in the world. And in that hall, buzzing with triumph and the promise of gold, he was immediately ordered to prepare a second, far grander voyage. The hero has returned. The gamble has paid off. The world is forever changed. But as the celebration in Spain begins, we must remember 39 men are still on Hispaniola, in a small wooden fort surrounded by a world they do not understand, and they are waiting. Now let your mind rest on that moment of triumph, and sleep. Welcome back. Find your rest. Let go of the day. We are here in the quiet to follow a story not of triumph, but of consequence. Last time we left a man at the very pinnacle of human existence. Christopher Columbus, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, had returned to Spain a living legend. He had done the impossible. He had sailed off the edge of the world and returned with parrots, gold, and people from an unknown land. He sat beside his king and queen, a weaver's son who had unlocked the world. He was a hero. But history is rarely that simple. A man can be a brilliant navigator and a catastrophic leader. A journey can begin in wonder and end in blood. And a hero's return can be the prelude to an inescapable fall. Tonight we follow the Admiral back into his new world, not as an explorer, but as a ruler. And we watch as the dream of a golden paradise collapses into a nightmare of his own making. The chains of the Admiral, the subsequent voyages and the fall from grace. The Admiral's second voyage, in 1493, was nothing like the first. The first was a desperate gamble with 3 small aging ships. The second was a grand imperial fleet, 17 ships, over 1,200 men, soldiers, priests, farmers, artisans, and hidalgos, minor nobles who had come not to work, but to rule. This was not a voyage of discovery. This was an invasion. This was colonization. The fleet's first priority was to return to Hispaniola, to the small wooden fort of La Navidad, where 39 men had been left behind. Columbus arrived expecting a joyous reunion, and he hoped a mountain of gold that his men had collected in his absence. He found only silence. The fort was a pile of burned timbers and ashes. The chests were broken, the salvaged goods were gone, and the men were all dead. Skeletons lay in the grass. The local Taino, once so welcoming, had vanished into the jungle. His friend, the chief Guacanagari, finally emerged and told a story. The men of La Navidad had been undone by their own greed. They had turned on each other and then on the Taino. They had roamed the island in gangs, stealing gold, hoarding food, and most disastrously, seizing and assaulting the Taino women. The gentle, peaceful people had finally been pushed too far. A neighboring chief, Kaonabo, had led a raid, and in a single violent night the first European settlement in the New World was wiped from the earth. This was the first turning point. The dream of a gentle, cooperative partnership was dead, along with his men. Columbus's response was not one of understanding. It was one of vengeance. From this moment, the Indians were no longer souls to be saved. They were a problem to be managed, a resource to be controlled, and a threat to be crushed. He was a brilliant admiral of the ocean sea, but he was a terrible governor of the Indies. He abandoned the ruins of La Navidad and sailed east, establishing a new, permanent settlement he named La Isabela after his queen. It was a disaster from the start. He chose a bad location. It was swampy, mosquito-ridden, and had no fresh water. Sickness spread like wildfire. The crops they had brought from Spain withered in the tropical heat, and the men he had brought were not farmers. They were adventurers, soldiers of the Reconquista, who believed it was beneath their dignity to build huts or plant grain. They had come for one thing and one thing only: gold. And there was no gold. Not as they knew it. There were no mines, no cities. There was only the dust the Taino found in rivers in tiny, frustrating amounts. The colony began to starve. The mood turned mutinous. The admiral, in his frustration, became a tyrant. He imposed harsh discipline, cut rations, and forced the noble hidalgos to perform manual labor. They began to despise him, this foreign-born upstart who had promised them riches and given them sickness and starvation. The crown was demanding a return on its massive investment. Columbus was growing desperate. He had to find gold. He led brutal military campaigns, entradas, deep into the island's interior, searching for the mythical mines. He took hundreds of Taino as prisoners. In 1495, he initiated a new, devastating policy. He needed to prove the colony was profitable. If he could not send gold, he would send slaves. He rounded up over 500 Taino men, women, and children, and shipped them to Spain to be sold in the slave markets of Seville. Queen Isabella, to her credit, was horrified. These people were her subjects, not her property. She ordered them returned. She had not funded a voyage to create a slave trade. Blocked from selling people, Columbus had to find a way to get gold. He instituted a policy of tribute. The system he created was simple, mathematical, and one of the most efficient instruments of cruelty ever devised. Every Taino man, woman, and child over the age of 14, living in the gold-producing regions of the island, was required to deliver a quota of gold dust every 3 months. The quota was the amount that would fill a small hawk's bell. It was an impossible demand. There simply was not that much gold in the rivers. When the Taino failed to meet their quota, the punishment was swift and horrific. Their hands were cut off and left to dangle from their necks as a warning to others. This tribute system did not create wealth. It created a genocide. The Taino, who had no concept of this kind of forced, relentless labor, were driven to mass suicide. They poisoned themselves with cassava. Mothers killed their own infants rather than see them enter this new world of impossible cruelty. Whole villages fled into the mountains where they were hunted down by Spanish dogs. In less than a decade, the native population of Hispaniola, estimated to be several 100,000, had collapsed by nearly 90%. While Columbus was on his disastrous third voyage, still frantically searching for the Asian mainland, exploring the coast of South America, his paradise of Hispaniola had descended into a full-blown civil war. The Spanish colonists, led by a man named Francisco Roldan, had finally rebelled against the admiral's brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, who were ruling in his absence. The island was in chaos. The reports that reached Spain were no longer of parrots and wonder. They were of starvation, mutiny, tyranny, and the spectacular, brutal failure of the admiral's leadership. Ferdinand and Isabella had had enough. In 1500, they sent a new man to Hispaniola. He was not an explorer. He was an investigator, a royal commissioner named Francisco de Bobadilla. His orders were to find out what was happening and to take control. When Bobadilla arrived, the first thing he saw was a gallows, with the bodies of 7 rebellious Spaniards swinging in the tropical breeze. He was horrified. He found the island in anarchy, the natives annihilated, and the colonists at war with the Columbus brothers. Bobadilla, armed with the full authority of the crown, acted swiftly. He seized the admiral's house. He listened to the testimony of the angry, starving colonists. And then he did the unthinkable. He summoned the admiral. And when Christopher Columbus, the viceroy of the Indies, presented himself, Bobadilla ordered him arrested. He ordered the great admiral, his brother Bartholomew, and his brother Diego to be put in iron chains. This is the ultimate image of the fall. The Christ-bearer, the man who had sat next to his queen, was now a prisoner, his ankles and wrists bound in cold, heavy iron. He was led onto a ship not as its commander, but as its cargo. The ship's captain, horrified, offered to remove the chains out of respect. Columbus, in a moment of bitter theatrical pride, refused. "The king and queen commanded me to submit to Bobadilla," he said. "By their authority I am in chains. I will wear these chains until they, by their royal order, command them to be removed, and I shall keep them as a relic, as a memorial of the reward for my services." He was sent back to Spain as a prisoner. The admiral of the Ocean Sea arrived in Cadiz in October 1500, a shuffling, humiliated old man, his chains clanking on the dock. The king and queen, when they heard, were embarrassed. They ordered him released. They pardoned him, but they did not restore his power. He was stripped of his titles of governor and viceroy. He could keep his admiral title, but he would never rule the lands he had found. He was given one last sad voyage. The fourth, it was a pathetic attempt to find the one thing he still believed was there. A strait, a passage through this new land to the real Indies, to Asia. It was a disaster. He was shipwrecked on the coast of Jamaica for over a year, his men mutinying, his mind and body broken, forced to beg for rescue. He returned to Spain for the last time, a forgotten man. He died in 1506, wealthy from the gold that now did flow from Hispaniola, but bitter, broken and clinging to his grand illusion to the very end. In his will he still referred to the lands he found as the Indies. He never accepted, never knew, that he had stumbled upon an entire unknown hemisphere. He died in obscurity, but he had kept his promise. He had requested that the chains, the symbols of his humiliation, be buried with him. The hero was a tyrant. The discoverer was a governor of death. The man who had united the world did so through an act of such profound accidental violence that it echoes to this day, and his chains, real and symbolic, became his true welcome. Welcome back to this quiet space. Let the noise and the light of your world recede. Let your muscles soften, and your mind unhitch itself from the worries of the day. You're here to drift, to listen, and to understand. We have followed a man across a dark ocean he believed was small. We have stood with him on a new shore, in a world he refused to see for what it was. We have watched his triumph and we have witnessed his fall, ending his days in bitterness, his wrists still feeling the ghost of a prisoner's chains. The story of the man, Christopher Columbus, is over. But the story of what he did, that story is still being written every single day. Tonight we are not talking about a man. We are talking about the world he left behind. He did not just open a new route. He tore a hole between two worlds and in doing so ended both of them, forging a single new and broken one in their place. This is the story of the greatest consequence in human history. This is the story of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange. A legacy of discovery and devastation. For millions of years, the planet had two separate, distinct biological laboratories. Two worlds. The Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, was one. The New World, the Americas, was the other. They were separated by vast, impassable oceans, and the life on each had evolved in total isolation. They had different plants, different animals, and crucially, different diseases. On October 12, 1492, that separation ended. The voyage of those three small ships did not just connect two cultures. It initiated a colossal, irreversible, and permanent transfer of life in both directions. It was the most profound biological event since the extinction of the dinosaurs, and we live inside its consequences every moment of every day. It began as a tragedy. The old world's gifts to the new were at first invisible and utterly catastrophic. The most powerful conquerors of the new world were not the Spanish in their armor. They were the microbes they carried unseen in their blood and breath. The peoples of the Americas, who had lived for millennia in isolation, had no domesticated herd animals, no cattle, no horses, no pigs, no sheep. Because of this, they had never been exposed to the zoonotic diseases that jumped from those animals to humans and had ravaged the old world for centuries. They had no built-up immunity. They were biologically a blank slate. When the Europeans arrived, they brought with them an invisible army. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague. The impact is, even today, impossible to fully comprehend. When smallpox arrived on Hispaniola, the Taino population which we met in our story was all but erased. The disease moved faster than the explorers themselves. When Hernán Cortés attacked the Aztec Empire, it was not his tiny army that won. It was a smallpox epidemic that tore through Tenochtitlan. killing nearly half the population and shattering their society before the final battle. This was the Great Dying. In the century and a half after Columbus's landing, it is estimated that as much as 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished. It was not a conquest as we imagine it. It was an apocalypse. Civilizations that had existed for thousands of years with their own art, astronomy, and languages simply vanished, leaving behind only ruins and silence. And then came the animals. The Old World brought its four-legged partners. The horse, which had been extinct in the Americas, was reintroduced. It revolutionized life, especially on the Great Plains, creating a new, nomadic, and powerful culture of buffalo hunters. But other animals were invaders. The pig was a perfect ecological weapon. Set loose, they multiplied at a terrifying rate. They swarmed across islands and continents, devouring the native plants and crops that both people and local animals relied on. Cattle and sheep, set to graze in their millions, remade the very landscape, turning forests into pasture in a great, slow act of terraforming. The Old World brought wheat, barley, rice, and crucially sugarcane. The desire for this one plant, sugar, would become a new hunger, an economic engine that would create a new and even darker chapter of the exchange. But the exchange was not a one-way street. The flow of life back to the Old World from the new to the old was just as profound. It did not bring devastation. It brought a revolution. It changed the daily life of every person in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and it is the single greatest legacy of the Americas. This revolution was not gold. It was plants first, the humble potato. This hardy, reliable tuber cultivated in the Andes was brought to Europe. At first it was a curiosity, but it grew anywhere. It survived cold, wet climates where wheat failed, and it was packed with calories. The potato ended famine in Northern Europe. It fueled a population explosion in Ireland, in Germany, and Prussia. The vast armies that would fight Europe's future wars were, in many ways, grown from soil fed by this simple American plant. Then, there was maize, or corn. A miracle crop, it grew quickly and in climates where rice and wheat could not. It was brought to the Mediterranean and it swept through Africa, becoming a staple food that supports hundreds of millions of people to this day. And then, there was the flavor. Can you imagine Italy without the tomato? Can you imagine Indian, Thai, or Chinese food without the searing heat of the chili pepper? Can you imagine West Africa without the peanut? All of these, tomatoes, chili peppers, peanuts, as well as beans, squash, and vanilla, are gifts from the New World. They so completely conquered the Old World that we have forgotten they were ever foreign. Finally, there were the plants of wealth and addiction, cacao, which gave the world chocolate, and tobacco, which became a global obsession and a source of immense wealth for the new American colonies. The gold and silver Columbus had dreamed of, it was found. The silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico were so vast that they funded the entire Spanish Empire for over a century. They financed Europe's great cathedrals and its endless wars. This flood of silver created the first truly global currency, and in the process upended the economies of the world. And this brings us to the final, most tragic part of the exchange, the human part. The diseases of the Old World had annihilated the native workforce of the New. The European discoverers, now colonists, had vast, fertile lands, especially for growing sugar, tobacco, and cotton. They needed a new source of labor, and so the Columbian Exchange created the triangular trade. European ships sailed to Africa, trading guns and goods for human beings. They transported millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, in horrific conditions. These enslaved people were then forced to work on the plantations of the Americas. to grow the New World crops that were then shipped back to the Old World to be sold for a massive profit. This was the true, complete, and terrible legacy. A new single global economy had been forged. A world where an African slave on an American island grew an American plant, sugar, to sweeten the tea of a European merchant, whose tea came from Asia. The world we live in is the Columbian exchange. When you wake in the morning, the coffee you drink is an Old World plant grown in the New World. The sugar you stir into it is an Old World plant grown in the New World, likely on lands once cleared by enslaved hands. The cornflakes in your bowl are a New World plant. The bacon beside them is from an Old World animal. The orange juice is from an Old World fruit. The chocolate is from a New World bean. Christopher Columbus, in his stubborn, glorious, and catastrophic error, did not discover a new world. He created one. He took two separate ancient worlds and, in one violent, chaotic, and irreversible collision, he fused them into the single, complex, blended, and haunted planet we all inhabit today. And now our story is at its end. The two halves of the world are one, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let your mind drift on this new